Dear learners, we have with us Professor Shubhangi Vaidya for next session on MST 013 Human Rights and Responsibilities. Welcome, ma'am. And ma'am, please start the session, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Rita. Thank you, Dr. Kuman. A very good afternoon to you, dear learners. And we continue today where we left off yesterday. Yesterday, we spoke about some very important issues of equity, equality, and social justice. And what we're going to be talking about today is a logical progression to what we have discussed yesterday, namely the issue of human rights. Now, you may wonder, why are we discussing human rights in a program on sustainability? Now, as you will see, the notion of human rights is very, very intricately tied with social justice as well as environmental rights and rights to a safe, clean, healthy environment for all. And naturally, these are very, very important issues that then feed into the whole notion of sustainability. So, as students of sustainability science, it is very important that we also understand what is meant by human rights, the importance of human rights globally and locally, and also the role of human rights in environmental movements, in environmental action, and in the whole concept of sustainability. So let's first try and understand what is meant by human rights. Now, as we've discussed, the concept of equity and equality in the understanding of human society and environment propagate the idea of progress, growth, and development, as well as justice to all. So basically, alongside with growth and development, justice is a very, very key indicator of development, or of development which is people centered and which is people friendly. The recognition of rights and obligations of people to protect their environment, to promote local knowledge and tradition, also pave the way to understanding the ideas of well being and livelihood. So, like is repeatedly stressed in your program, the importance of local knowledge and tradition in trying to really understand notions of livelihood, notions of well being, notions of environmental protection is very, very important. We cannot only have a top down approach wherein developmental experts or environmental experts tell people what is good for them, but we also need to draw upon the local knowledge, the traditions that have been in place for centuries, and the various cultural treasures, the various the rich cultural heritage of environmental protection that every society has. This notion then gives us the concept of human rights, which is basically a right to live life with dignity. Okay? Now, the very notion of rights implies justice. The two concepts are very, very intricately intertwined. You cannot speak about rights where there is no justice. However, as we've seen in various other contexts, as we've seen throughout this program, various developmental programs often lead to very, very serious questions, or have many, many issues and challenges as far as the rights of the poor and the vulnerable are concerned. And these would be programs that basically work from a top down approach. These are developmental programs that basically talk in terms of large scale, okay, mega programs where the people's participation is really not factored in, community values, what the community needs, people-centered participation is really not factored in. So these kinds of developmental programs actually further marginalize the poor and the vulnerable. And as we mentioned earlier, the protection of environment is also part and parcel of protection of human rights. When the environment is safe for people, only then can human rights have some meaning. People without the environment, in an unsafe environment, in a polluted environment, in a degraded environment, the whole notion of human rights really becomes quite pointless and meaningless in a sense. Human rights literally mean the rights that one has because one is human. So, just by virtue of being a human being, you have certain universal, inalienable rights. And these rights cannot be discriminated, or these rights cannot be taken away from you on any kind of discriminatory ground, irrespective of your race, your nationality, your gender, religion, language, or any other status. rich, poor, old, young, able, disabled, man, woman, whatever it is, just by virtue of being a human being, you have a set of universal and inalienable rights. Now, the very famous UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 is a very, very important rights based instrument which lays in place an entire framework for human rights and the protection of human rights. So, human rights mean rights relating to life, liberty, equality, and dignity of the individual, guaranteed by the Constitution or embodied in various international covenants. So, there are many, many international instruments, there are many, many international treaties which really embody human rights. And the constitutions of many countries, including ours, also have very, very strong human rights based frameworks which lay in place certain human rights which are common or which belong to each and every citizen and other people living in that country. So we have in our context, for instance, we have our fundamental rights, which we'll be talking about a little bit later. Now, an important issue that presents itself in this context is the notion of cultural relativism. Now, when we speak about human rights as being universal, something that is really inalienable, that hold good for everybody, irrespective of any kind of difference, the question then arises that in different cultural contexts, how does this notion of universal and inalienable rights play out? Now, the idea of cultural relativism, which is a very, very important concept in anthropology, for instance, see, every culture has got its own way of functioning. Every culture has its own norms, values, ideas, and traditions, and these may vary from group to group and culture to culture. And cultural relativism is that concept or that attitude which looks at all cultures as being valuable, which does not make any difference between one culture and the next, does not say that my culture is superior to yours and yours is inferior to mine, right? So the notion of human rights, in a sense, can be challenged when we look at the differences that pertain or the differences of customs, values, and traditions that exist in different cultures. Now, we find that globalization, the race for development, and the interaction between people and cultures is increasing day by day. In the previous talk, also, we had discussed how globalization refers to the process wherein there is a movement of people, products, and processes across the globe. And these kinds of movements, these kinds of interfaces, these kinds of interactions often create tensions and conflicts and also confusion, along with the process of adjustment and assimilation. So, while talking about universal rights, we also need to take into account cultural relativism. We also need to take into account the different problems and challenges that come into play when different cultures come into contact and interact with each other. Now, while talking about human rights and development, the issue of poverty and development also becomes extremely important. And as we have repeatedly said, contemporary developmental processes have deprived the poor from access to natural resources, in many cases made them illegal migrants and laborers, caused health problems, malnutrition, and so on and so forth. Very often we find that developmental projects have ended up polluting the environment so terribly that the water sources are contaminated and lead to all kinds of health related problems. Soil loses its fertility. So, those communities that were living by the land find that agriculture has become, impracticable, has become untenable. So, these kinds of issues which act upon the environment or which impact upon the environment then leads people to be deprived of their livelihoods, to be in a sense, forced away from their natural habitats and forces them to find livelihoods and migrate to different places. Now, this, like we mentioned, can often lead to all kinds of legal problems. If for instance, migration from villages to towns leads to all kinds of issues of rights, issues of entitlements, so many border crossings where people have been forced to leave their native places and migrate across borders, leads to all kinds of human rights issues, leads to all kinds of legal issues, leads to the issues of refugees and other problems, all of which we are seeing happening in the world even as we speak. We find that systems and means to reduce poverty in the name of development projects and financial assistance through various institutions may in fact be creating poverty independence. What do we mean by this? For instance, certain developmental projects which end up destroying local livelihoods. There may be compensations given to the people who have been deprived of their land or have been deprived of their livelihood. But these compensations only make them, in a sense, dependent upon the state or dependent upon the giver of these benefits rather than helping them to foster self reliance or helping them to flourish independently. And various developmental processes across the world we see directly or indirectly damage the livelihood patterns of the poor and the vulnerable. Now, as we know, the 1986 General Assembly Declaration on the Right to Development made it a human right, which includes full sovereignty over natural resources, self determination, popular participation in development, equality of opportunity, and the creation of favorable conditions for the enjoyment of other civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. And therefore, it requires an effective development policy and programs at the local and national level to provide this right to development to one and all. A very important topic that we need to discuss in this context, in the context of human rights, in the context of environmental protections, and the rights of citizens to lead a life in a safe and healthy environment, includes the role of NGOs. What role do NGOs promote in human rights? Now, you know that NGOs are non-profit organizations which are neither intergovernmental agreements nor do they involve direct participation of governments. That's why they're called non-government organizations. They are formed at the local, the national, and the international levels. And the NGOs have different focuses and interest areas which are meant for public good. So there are some NGOs which may be working with children, there may be some which work with women's issues, some which work with issues of the disabled population, others that work at poverty alleviation. And of course, there are NGOs that work specifically in the area of human rights. And the contribution of NGOs to the world community includes protection of environment, social justice, provision of education, social service to protect and to promote human rights. So, in a sense, any kind of social justice related work is human rights related work. So, as we've mentioned, the contribution of NGOs to the promotion and protection of human rights is quite significant. And these human rights NGOs, for instance, you're aware of Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, etc., these are different from other NGOs which are involved in other fields, in the sense that they seek to protect the rights of all the members of human society, rather than a particular group or nations. So human rights NGOs really focus on humanity. Their field or their area of work is humanity as such, humanity in general. And humanity and its value provide no national and cultural boundary to them. So humanity is something which transcends, human rights is something which transcends national and cultural boundaries or barriers. And several human rights NGOs and activists we see are working in different areas, especially in developing and underdeveloped countries, in conflict zones, in areas where there are, pronounced racial, ethnic, etc., conflicts underway. And they play a very, very crucial role in alerting the world community to the kinds of atrocities or to the kinds of human rights violations that are taking place. It's important to mention that the work that they also do it can very often be personally very dangerous. Often human rights activists come under all kinds of threats. The work that they do is often questioned. It becomes politically extremely vitiated. Many of them work at risk of their very lives. And this is what makes their work particularly important and something that needs to be given due respect and due regards to. So one of the very important things that they do is they collect information on various rights atrocities and pressurize the government or whatever agency or whatever community is violating these rights. They act as pressure groups to make the violators accept their violations and to respect the rights of those whose rights they're violating. The social utility of human rights, giving relief and protection to the victims of human rights violations, is facing, expressing, and solving problems. So there is a tremendous amount of social utility also involved in their work. Not just do they pressurize governments, not just do they pressurize larger groups, but they also work in a very hands-on way with those who are actually experiencing violations, the victims of these violations, and help them to actually find strategies, help them to find solutions in solving their problems. And one of the important things that they do is taking legal assistance from legal advocacy cells or groups. They deal with human rights violations and victims, for instance, human trafficking, refugees of war, boundary issues, the issues of vulnerable sections of the society. This would include particularly, violation of the human rights of children, violence against women, issues like child marriage, so many issues which are being experienced by vulnerable sections of society in today's times. And they engage in dialogue to negotiate compromises or pressurize governments to check their actions. And thus, they play an extremely valuable role in the world community. Let's look at human rights now and environmental protection. Since basically our area, the focus of our study is sustainability, let's look at the role that human rights play in environmental protection. Now, as you know, there is a close relationship between human rights and environmental protection. And safe and adequate environment is one of the means by which human rights can be protected and promoted. However, the changes in the physical, chemical, and biological conditions in the environment create problems for human existence. And this includes excess consumption, pollution, destruction of habitats and livelihoods, etc. And of course, this has a very, very crucial impact, a critical impact upon human health and demands our attention. So the United Nations Conference on Human Environment in 1972 at Stockholm, Sweden, emphasized the rights of humans to freedom, equality, and adequate conditions of life in an environment of quality that permits a life of dignity and well-being. So remember that without a quality environment, the rights that human beings are assumed to have as inalienable, these become difficult to exercise because if the environment in which they live is inimical or is problematic or is oppressive or is unhealthy, freedom, equality, etc., then become very difficult goals to achieve. And also, it's interesting to note that in over 100 constitutions, the right to healthy environment is a value that is enshrined. You're all aware of the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals, which clearly map out the need for environmental protection and sustainability as crucial to the development of humankind. So when, for instance, we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, and I think a lot has been said about this, you find that these goals include eradication of poverty, eradication of hunger, right to education, right to livelihoods, right, freedom from gender discrimination, the rights to a life that is free of climate change, rights to clean drinking water, rights to the riches and the resources of the sea, of the land. So when we look, for instance, at the Sustainable Development Goals, we see how interconnected and how important all dimensions of human life and activity are, along with the well-being of the ecosystem and the ecology as such. So, for instance, if you just take one goal, goal number 5, that is gender freedom from gender exploitation or gender justice, gender equality, you cannot have that if you have an environment which is not sustainable. You cannot have that if there is environmental degradation, because the biggest brunt of this will be borne by women. So the whole talk of gender justice then becomes, in a sense, just talk if the environment is not suitable, if the environment is not giving a suitable and a healthy kind of a backdrop or a kind of a place for women and children to grow and develop to their full potential. The Constitution of India also provides very important environmental protection guarantees under different articles and acts. For example, Article 48A, 51AG, Sections 312, 13, 14, and 16 of the IPC, Article 21, etc. And we'll have a brief look at some of these. Now, the Environment Protection Act of 1986 defines the environment in the following way. Environment includes water, air, and land, and the interrelationship which exists among and between air, water, and land, and human beings, other living creatures, plants, microorganisms, and property. So just see what an integrated and holistic definition this is. The environment includes not just the natural environment, but also all the species that live on it, human beings, human systems, human values, human society, human culture. So, in a sense, environment encompasses all these systems, right? The chapter on the fundamental duties of the Indian Constitution, that is Article 51AG, enjoins every citizen to protect the environment. And this article says that it shall be the duty of every citizen of India to protect and improve the natural environment, including forests, lakes, rivers, and wildlife, and to have compassion for living creatures. I think the last point is very, very important for us to keep in mind: compassion for living creatures. Cruelty to animals, cruelty to non-human species is something, unfortunately, that is endemic. And one of the units in this particular block will be addressing that subsequently. Article 47 provides that the state shall regard as one of its primary duties the raising of the level of nutrition and the standard of living of its people and the improvement of public health. And the improvement of public health also includes the protection and improvement of the environment. Article 48 addresses organization of agriculture and animal husbandry, directing the state to take steps to organize agriculture and animal husbandry on modern and scientific lines. Article 48A of the Constitution says that the state shall endeavor to protect and improve the environment and to safeguard the forests and wildlife of the country. The Constitution of India, under Part 3, guarantees fundamental rights which are essential for the development of the individual. And right to environment is also a right to enable the realization of his or her full potential. Articles 21, 14, and 19 have been used for environmental protection. Article 21 of the Constitution is the fundamental right which guarantees the fundamental right to life. And when we speak about the fundamental right to life, the right to environment, to be free from danger of disease, infections, etc., is very much a part and parcel of it. And therefore, the right to healthy environment is an important attribute of the life to live with human dignity. The link from where I have got this information on the various rights is given in the PPT and it can be circulated separately to you also so that you may read the article. Let's continue talking about human rights and environmental rights. Now, in this context, we can talk about two kinds of rights, which are substantive rights and procedural rights. Now, substantive rights are those in which the environment has a direct effect on the existence or the enjoyment of the right itself. And this would include civil and political rights, such as the rights to life, freedom of association, freedom from discrimination, economic and social rights, such as right to health, food, and an adequate standard of living, cultural rights, such as right to access religious sites, and collective rights affected by environmental degradation, such as the rights of indigenous people. And procedural rights prescribe formal steps to be taken in enforcing legal rights and include three fundamental access rights, namely access to information, to public participation, and access to justice. You can read more about this from the site www.unep.org. Let's talk now about something that is a very serious matter and something that we are seeing around us all the time, a very disturbing reality, but something that we have to apply our minds towards and try to find remedies to. And that is the violation of human rights that is taking place globally and what are the remedies for the same. Now, common phenomenon worldwide. racial atrocities. These are the most common atrocities that take place all over the world. Violation of the rights of children, women, persons with disabilities, ethnic minorities, workers and laborers, Dalits, tribals, etc. I think this is something that all of you need to understand, to reflect upon, to try and apply your minds when you are reading about rights abuses and what impact this has upon sustainability, how human rights, environmental rights, and individual rights are also intricately interconnected. Any action which breaches the dignity and well being of an individual or groups, inhuman or degrading treatment would come under human rights violations. And based upon the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, our Constitution provides basic fundamental rights and provisions to its citizens and other persons. And violations of human rights are considered unconstitutional. Briefly, to end this presentation, we'll talk about a very important rights body in the Indian context, which is the National Human Rights Commission. Now, in India, the NHRC, as we call it, has been constituted in 1993 under the Section 3 of the Protection of Human Rights Act, which we call the PHRA Act. It is in conformity with the Paris Principles adopted at the first international workshop in national institutions for the promotion and protection of human rights held in Paris in October 1991 and endorsed by the General Assembly of the United Nations by its Regulations 48/134 of 20th December 1993. You can find all this on the NHRC website, that is www.nhrc.nic.in. And the NHRC is really an embodiment of India's concern for the promotion and protection of human rights. And Section 121D of the PHRA defines human rights as rights relating to life, liberty, equality, and dignity of the individual, guaranteed by the Constitution or embodied in the international covenants and enforceable by courts in India. To sum up, we can say that human rights are the universal, inalienable rights given to every individual, irrespective of differences in social, economic, political, etc. status. It is crucial for us to understand the concept of human rights due to its relationship with the notion of social justice and environmental justice, contributing to sustainability. The rights to environmental protection and justice have become an intrinsic part of human rights frameworks, both globally as well as nationally. And it is only through the realization and protection of these rights that a sustainable world order may be achieved. So I'll stop my presentation here and open up the floor for discussion. Yeah. Yes, thank you. We had such a lively discussion yesterday. Let's hope we have one today also, because human rights is a very, very important and crucial area which impacts all of us, impacts all our lives. Any questions, comments, observations?
RC Delhi to please put off the recording. RC Delhi to Rita, please put off recording.
Dr. Kuman, maybe you would like to initiate discussion on this, since you're there.